When single father Daniel Cross pulled CEO Isabella Grant from her burning Maserati on that freezing Chicago morning, he expected gratitude. Instead, her first chilling words, "I know who you are," would shatter everything he thought he knew about his invisible life. What secret could a struggling janitor possibly hide that would make one of the most powerful women in America recognize him instantly? Stay with me until the end of this incredible journey, and don't forget to comment what city you're watching from, so I can see how far this story has traveled across the world. The smell of smoke and desperation hung thick in the Chicago air that Tuesday morning, mixing with the bitter wind that cut through Daniel Cross's worn jacket like a knife through paper. At 34, Daniel had learned to make himself invisible, a skill perfected through years of pushing a mop through the gleaming corridors of Grant Industries, while the world's most important people walked past him as if he were furniture. But today, invisibility would fail him. Daniel's calloused hands gripped the steering wheel of his 15-year-old Honda Civic as he navigated through the morning traffic, his mind already calculating the day ahead. Drop Lily at school check. 8 hours of cleaning corporate offices check. Pick up groceries with whatever was left of his paycheck, maybe. It was the same routine that had governed his life for the past 3 years, ever since Sarah had died and left him to raise their 6-year-old daughter alone. "Daddy, why do you look sad in the mornings?" Lily had asked him just that morning, her innocent brown eyes, so much like her mother's, studying his face as he tied her shoelaces. "I'm not sad, sweetheart," he'd lied, forcing a smile that felt like lifting weights. "Daddy's just thinking about work." "Will you ever get a different job? One that makes you smile with your eyes?" The question had haunted him during the 20-minute drive to her school, echoing in his mind as he watched her small figure disappear through the doors of Lincoln Elementary. Smile with your eyes. When had he stopped doing that? Now, as Daniel turned onto Michigan Avenue, his thoughts were interrupted by the screech of tires and the sickening crunch of metal against concrete. 50 yards ahead, a silver Maserati had lost control on a patch of black ice, spinning twice before slamming into a concrete barrier with enough force to crumple the front end like an accordion. For a heartbeat, the world seemed frozen. Steam rose from the wreckage, and Daniel could see a figure slumped over the steering wheel. Then he smelled it, gasoline sharp and acrid in the morning air. Without thinking, Daniel yanked his car to the curb and sprinted toward the wreck. His work boots slipped on the ice, but he caught himself and kept running. Behind him, other cars had stopped their drivers, pulling out phones to record rather than help. The modern world in a nutshell. Document first, act later. "Hey!" Daniel shouted as he reached the Maserati. "Can you hear me?" The driver was a woman probably in her early 40s with auburn hair matted with blood from a cut on her forehead. She wore a charcoal business suit that probably cost more than Daniel made in 3 months. Even unconscious and injured, she radiated the kind of authority that commanded boardrooms and crushed competitors. The smell of gas was getting stronger. "Ma'am, we need to get you out of here," Daniel said, trying the driver's door. It was jammed shut, the frame bent from impact. The passenger door was blocked by the concrete barrier. He'd have to get her out through the driver's side window, which had spider-webbed, but hadn't completely shattered. Daniel grabbed a chunk of concrete debris and carefully knocked out the remaining glass, then reached inside to check her pulse. Strong and steady, good. But when he tried to unbuckle her seatbelt, his fingers froze. The woman was wearing a name badge, Isabella Grant, CEO, Grant Industries. His boss. Well, technically, his boss's 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 boss. The woman whose company employed him to empty her trash cans and mop her floors. The woman whose picture hung in the lobby he cleaned every night, looking down at him with those same sharp green eyes that were now closed in unconsciousness. A small flame flickered near the engine block. Shit, Daniel muttered, then louder. Ma'am, I'm going to get you out, but I need you to stay calm if you wake up, okay? The seatbelt was stuck. Daniel pulled harder, his muscles straining against the twisted metal. The flame was growing, licking at the underside of the hood. In maybe 2 minutes, this whole thing would go up like a Roman candle. Come on, he whispered, working his fingers under the belt mechanism. There it clicked free. But now came the hard part. Isabella Grant was taller than she'd looked in her corporate photos, maybe 5'8", and while she wasn't heavy, she was dead weight. Daniel slipped his arms under hers and began to pull her through the window opening, being careful not to let the broken glass cut her. Is someone calling 911? He shouted to the growing crowd of onlookers. Already called? Someone yelled back. Fire department's on the way. The fire department. Daniel almost laughed. At the rate that flame was spreading, the fire department would arrive just in time to hose down the ashes. He had Isabella about halfway out when she stirred, her eyelids fluttering. For a moment, those green eyes were unfocused, confused. Then they sharpened with the kind of intelligence that had built a multi-billion-dollar company from scratch. What? She started to say, then winced as pain from her head wound hit her. Easy, Daniel said, still pulling her free. You've been in an accident. We need to get you away from the car. Isabella's gaze focused on his face, and Daniel saw something shift in her expression. Recognition. But that was impossible. She'd never even looked at him during his 3 years of cleaning her office building. I can walk, she said, her voice stronger than he'd expected. Are you sure you hit your head pretty hard? I'm sure. Daniel helped her to her feet, and together they stumbled away from the wreckage. They'd made it maybe 20 yards when the Maserati erupted in a ball of orange flame that sent a wave of heat washing over them. The crowd gasped and stepped back, several people still filming with their phones. Isabella Grant stood there watching her car burn, her hair disheveled and her expensive suit torn, but her posture still radiating command. She touched the cut on her forehead, and her fingers came away bloody. Are you hurt anywhere else? Daniel asked. Maybe we should wait for the paramedics to... I'm fine. She cut him off, then turned to look at him directly. Really look at him as if she were seeing through his work clothes and calloused hands to something underneath. What's your name? Daniel, he said automatically. Daniel Cross. Isabella nodded slowly, as if confirming something she already knew. Then she spoke the words that would haunt him for days to come. I know who you are. The simple sentence hit Daniel like a physical blow. He stepped back, his mind racing. How could she possibly know who he was? He was nobody, a janitor, a single father struggling to make ends meet. He cleaned her building at night when she wasn't even there. They'd never spoken, never even been in the same room. I'm sorry, he managed. But Isabella was already walking toward the approaching sirens, her stride confident despite the blood on her face. She paused just long enough to look back at him. Daniel Cross, she said, as if testing the name. We'll be in touch. Then she was gone, swept away by paramedics and police officers, and the controlled chaos that surrounds powerful people in crisis. Daniel stood there in the middle of Michigan Avenue, watching the flames consume what was left of the Maserati, trying to make sense of what had just happened. A police officer approached him, notepad in hand. Sir, I understand you pulled the victim from the vehicle. Yeah, Daniel said, still distracted. Yeah, I did. Can I get your contact information? We'll need a statement. Daniel rattled off his phone number and address mechanically, his mind still replaying those 4 words, I know who you are. What could they possibly mean, and why did Isabella Grant look at him like she was solving a puzzle? 20 minutes later, Daniel was back in his Honda, hands shaking as he tried to start the engine. He was already late for work, which meant explaining to his supervisor why he smelled like smoke and had glass shards on his jacket. It meant another mark against him, in a job he couldn't afford to lose. But as he drove toward the Grant Industries building, the same building where he'd cleaned Isabella Grant's office countless times, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that his invisible life was about to become very visible indeed. The Grant Industries tower rose 47 floors into the Chicago sky, a monument to steel and glass, and the American dream of building something from nothing. Isabella Grant had built it brick by brick from a small engineering firm her father had left her into one of the most innovative companies in the world. Her name was literally written in gold letters across the top. And Daniel Cross spent his nights making sure her toilets were clean. He parked in the employee lot behind the building, the same lot where he'd parked every weeknight for 3 years. His supervisor Martinez was waiting by the service entrance, checking his watch, with the kind of theatrical irritation that suggested Daniel was in for a lecture. "Cross, where the hell have you been?" Martinez barked. "Shift started an hour ago." "Sorry," Daniel said, pulling on his work uniform. "There was an accident on Michigan Avenue. I helped." "I don't care if the Pope needed mouth-to-mouth." Martinez cut him off. "You're here to work, not play Good Samaritan. The executive floors need to be done by 10, and Mrs. Grant's coming in early tomorrow for some big meeting." Daniel's blood went cold. "Mrs. Grant's coming in early." "Yeah, some emergency board meeting or something. Point is, her office better be spotless or it's your ass. Got it?" "Got it," Daniel said weakly. He spent the next hour in a daze going through the motions of his routine. Vacuum the lobby. Empty the trash cans on floors 1 through 10. Restock the break room supplies. Normal work, invisible work, the kind that kept the world running, while the important people focused on important things. But when the elevator doors opened on the 47th floor, Isabella Grant's floor, Daniel felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Her office was at the far end of the executive suite behind double doors made of mahogany that probably cost more than most people's cars. Daniel had cleaned this office hundreds of times, always when it was empty, always in the dark hours between midnight and dawn, when the building belonged to the maintenance crew. Tonight, for the first time in 3 years, the lights were on. Daniel stood frozen in the hallway, his cleaning cart beside him, staring at those glowing windows. She was in there. The woman who'd looked at him like she knew his deepest secrets, the woman whose life he'd saved that morning, was sitting behind that massive desk working while he stood in the hallway with a mop bucket. "Might as well get it over with," he muttered to himself. Daniel knocked on the door frame, then pushed the cart inside. Isabella Grant sat behind her desk, still wearing the same torn business suit from the accident, a small bandage covering the cut on her forehead. She was reviewing what looked like financial reports, her green eyes scanning columns of numbers with laser focus. She looked up when he entered, and Daniel saw that same recognition flash across her face. "Mr. Cross?" she said simply. "Ma'am," Daniel replied, not trusting himself to say more. He began emptying her wastebasket, trying to blend into the background, the way he'd perfected over years of invisible work. "How long have you worked here?" Isabella asked. Daniel glanced up, surprised. In 3 years, no executive had ever asked him a direct question. "3 years, ma'am." "Night shift?" "Yes, ma'am. Midnight to 8. Isabella nodded, making a note on her legal pad. "Tell me, Mr. Cross, what did you do before you became a janitor?" The question hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. He straightened up, still holding the wastebasket, and for a moment he considered lying. Considered spinning some story about how he'd always been in maintenance, how cleaning office buildings was his lifelong passion. Instead, he found himself telling the truth. "I was an engineer," he said quietly. "Mechanical engineering. I had a small firm with a partner. We designed water filtration systems for developing countries. Had my wife got sick." Daniel said the words coming out in a rush now like water through a broken dam. "Cancer. The medical bills. We had to liquidate everything. After she died, I needed steady work, steady insurance. This was what I could find." Isabella Grant leaned back in her leather chair, studying him with those sharp green eyes. "And your engineering degree?" "Still have it. Not much use when you're pushing a mop at 2 a.m. "No," Isabella said slowly. "I suppose not." She was quiet for a long moment, and Daniel went back to his cleaning, emptying the recycling bin and dusting the bookshelf that held Isabella's various awards and honors. CEO of the Year, Innovator of the Decade, Woman Who Changed the World. "Mr. Cross," Isabella said finally, "do you know what Grant Industries does?" Daniel paused in his dusting. Of course he knew he'd been cleaning their offices for 3 years, but somehow he sensed this was a test that his answer mattered more than it should. "You design infrastructure solutions," he said. "Water treatment, power grid optimization, sustainable urban development. You built the water system that serves half of Chicago." Isabella's eyebrows rose slightly. "Most people just say we're an engineering company." "Most people don't read your annual reports while they're emptying your trash," Daniel replied, then immediately regretted the words. Too honest, too revealing. But Isabella smiled, the first genuine smile Daniel had seen from her all day. "No," she said. "I suppose they don't." Daniel finished his work in silence, hyper-aware of Isabella's presence as she continued reviewing her documents. When he was done, he began pushing his cart toward the door, eager to escape the strange intensity of her attention. "Mr. Cross," she called out, as he reached the threshold. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you. For this morning, I mean. You saved my life." Daniel nodded awkwardly. "Anyone would have done the same thing." "No," Isabella said, her voice carrying absolute certainty. "They wouldn't have." As Daniel left her office and continued his rounds through the empty building, he couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The careful invisibility he'd cultivated for 3 years had been stripped away in the space of a single conversation, leaving him exposed and uncertain. He thought about Lily's words from that morning. "Will you ever get a different job, one that makes you smile with your eyes?" For the first time in 3 years, Daniel wondered if maybe, just maybe, the answer might be yes. The rest of the week passed in a haze of routine and anxiety. Daniel went through his normal schedule, drop Lily at school, sleep through the morning, work his day job at a construction site pickup. Lily help with homework, grab a few hours of sleep, then head to Grant Industries for his night shift. The same pattern he'd followed for 3 years, but now everything felt different. Isabella Grant was everywhere. Not physically after that first night. Her office was dark again during Daniel's shifts, and he went back to cleaning it in solitude. But her presence haunted the building like a ghost. Daniel found himself looking for signs of her during his rounds, coffee cups still warm in the break room, documents left on printers, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the elevator. And then there were the questions. Martinez had cornered him twice, asking about the conversation he'd had with Mrs. Grant. Security had reviewed the building footage and wanted to know why he'd spent 23 minutes in the CEO's office instead of his usual 8. Even the other janitors were looking at him sideways, as if association with the executive suite might be contagious. "Just stick to your job, Cross," Martinez had warned him. "Whatever game you think you're playing with the executives, it's going to end badly. They're not your friends." Daniel knew Martinez was right. He'd been invisible for 3 years, and invisibility was safety. The moment you tried to rise above your station, the world had a way of reminding you exactly where you belonged. But he couldn't stop thinking about that moment in Isabella's office when she'd smiled at his comment about reading annual reports. For 30 seconds, he'd felt like the engineer he used to be instead of the janitor he'd become. For 30 seconds, he'd remembered what it felt like to matter. Friday night brought the weekly ritual that had become sacred in the Cross household: pizza and homework at their tiny kitchen table. Daniel watched Lily work through her math problems, her tongue poking out in concentration, the same way Sarah's used to when she was focused on a design challenge. "Daddy," Lily said, without looking up from her worksheet. "Mrs. Patterson says you haven't turned in the permission slip for the Science Museum field trip." Daniel's stomach dropped. The field trip was next Friday, and the permission slip was somewhere in the pile of unpaid bills and past due notices that lived on his dresser. More importantly, the trip cost $25 per student, money he didn't have. "I'll get that to her on Monday," he said, hoping his voice sounded more confident than he felt. "Will you be able to come with us?" Lily asked, finally looking up. "Tommy's dad is coming and Sarah's mom. I told them my dad might come too." Daniel's heart clenched. Lily's classmates had parents who could take time off work for field trips, parents who didn't have to choose between groceries and school activities. He worked 60 hours a week between his 2 jobs just to keep them afloat. And even then, they were always one emergency away from disaster. "We'll see, sweetheart," he said, the same non-answer he'd been giving for 3 years. "Daddy has to work, but maybe I can figure something out." Lily nodded and went back to her math, but Daniel caught the flash of disappointment that crossed her face. She was 6 years old and already learning to lower her expectations. The thought made him sick. Later that night, as Daniel pushed his cart through the Grant Industries lobby, he found himself staring at the wall of photographs that documented the company's history. There was Isabella as a young woman standing beside her father at the groundbreaking ceremony for their first major project. Isabella accepting an award from the mayor. Isabella shaking hands with senators and CEOs and Nobel Prize winners. In every photo, she looked like she belonged there. Like the world had always intended for her to stand in those rooms, making those decisions, changing those lives. Daniel had felt that way once. Before Sarah got sick, before the medical bills crushed his dreams, before he learned to make himself invisible, he'd been the kind of person who belonged in those photos. He'd had plans, ambitions, the bone-deep certainty that his work mattered. Now he cleaned toilets and wondered how he was going to pay for his daughter's field trip. "Working late again, Mr. Cross?" Daniel spun around, nearly knocking over his mop bucket. Isabella Grant stood 20 feet away, dressed in jeans and a casual sweater that somehow made her look more intimidating than her usual business suits. She held a steaming coffee cup and wore the expression of someone who'd been watching him for a while. "Mrs. Grant," Daniel stammered. "I didn't know you were here." "I couldn't sleep," Isabella said, walking closer. "Sometimes I come in late to catch up on work. The building's quieter at night." "Yes, ma'am. I can come back later if you'd prefer." "Don't be ridiculous." Isabella settled into one of the lobby chairs, cradling her coffee. "I'm curious about something, Mr. Cross. When you were an engineer, what kind of projects did you work on?" Daniel hesitated, unsure why she was asking. "Water filtration systems, mostly. My partner and I designed low-cost purification units for villages in Africa and South America. Places where the local water sources were contaminated, but they couldn't afford traditional treatment plants." "Interesting." Isabella sipped her coffee. "What made you choose that specialty?" "My wife," Daniel said without thinking, then caught himself. "I mean, it was her idea originally. Sarah believed clean water was a human right, not a privilege. She said, if we were going to be engineers, we should engineer solutions that actually helped people. Smart woman. She was. Isabella nodded thoughtfully. Tell me about the filtration systems. How did they work? For the next hour, Daniel found himself explaining his old work in detail, the membrane technology, the solar power integration, the maintenance protocols designed for communities with limited technical resources. As he talked, he felt a familiar fire kindling in his chest, the passion that had once driven him to work 18-hour days, because the work itself was a form of worship. Isabella listened with the kind of focused attention that made Daniel feel like the most important person in the room. She asked technical questions that proved she understood the engineering principles, strategic questions that showed she grasped the bigger picture, practical questions that demonstrated her grasp of real-world implementation challenges. It was the best conversation Daniel had had in 3 years. How many people did your system serve? Isabella asked finally. About 40,000 across 12 villages. Daniel said, pride creeping into his voice despite himself. Before Sarah got sick, we were planning to expand into Southeast Asia. We had funding lined up, partnerships with NGOs, everything. And then reality happened. Daniel's voice went flat. Medical bills, bankruptcy, single parenthood. You can't save the world when you can't save your own family. Isabella was quiet for a long moment, studying his face in the fluorescent lobby lighting. When she spoke again, her voice was gentle. Mr. Cross, can I ask you something personal? Daniel nodded, though every instinct told him to be careful. Do you ever regret it, giving up engineering to take care of your wife and daughter? The question hit Daniel like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to give the expected answer. Of course not, family comes first. No sacrifice is too great for the people you love. But something in Isabella's green eyes made him tell the truth instead. Every day, he whispered, and I hate myself for it. Isabella nodded, as if she'd expected that answer. My father built this company from nothing, she said. When I took over, people said I was just riding his coattails, that I'd never amount to more than a pretty face in a business suit. So I worked twice as hard as anyone else, sacrificed everything. Relationships, friendships, any chance at a normal life to prove I belonged here. She paused, staring into her coffee cup. But sometimes I wonder what I might have been if I hadn't spent so much energy proving what I wasn't. Daniel didn't know what to say to that. Isabella Grant was one of the most successful people in Chicago, maybe in America. What could she possibly regret? The thing is, Isabella continued, talent doesn't disappear just because circumstances change. Skills don't evaporate because life gets hard. You're still an engineer, Mr. Cross. You're just an engineer who happens to be working as a janitor. Before Daniel could respond, Isabella stood and headed for the elevator. She paused at the doors, looking back at him. There's something I want to show you, she said. Monday morning, 9 a.m., 32nd floor, conference room B. Can you be there? I work days on Monday, Daniel said automatically. Not anymore, Isabella replied. I'm giving you the day off. Paid. The elevator doors closed, leaving Daniel alone in the lobby, with his mop bucket and 1,000 questions. He finished his rounds in a daze, his mind racing through possibilities and implications, and the growing certainty that his invisible life was about to become very, very complicated. As he drove home through the empty Chicago streets, Daniel thought about Lily's question, will you ever get a different job, one that makes you smile with your eyes? For the first time in 3 years, he wondered if the answer might actually be yes. But first, he had to figure out what Isabella Grant knew about him that he didn't know about himself. and why the most powerful woman in Chicago seemed determined to drag him back into the light he'd spent 3 years trying to escape. Monday morning would bring answers. Daniel just wasn't sure he was ready for them. Monday morning arrived with the kind of bitter Chicago wind that cut through everything, including Daniel's resolve. He stood outside the Grant Industries building at 8:45 a.m. wearing his only good shirt, a blue button-down Sarah had bought him for their anniversary 4 years ago, and fighting the urge to turn around and go home. This was insane. He was a janitor. Janitors didn't have meetings in conference rooms on the 32nd floor. They cleaned them. But Isabella Grant's words from Friday night echoed in his mind. "You're still an engineer, Mr. Cross. You're just an engineer who happens to be working as a janitor." The statement had kept him awake for 2 nights, turning over in his head like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. Daniel checked his reflection in the building's glass doors one more time, smoothing down his hair and trying to look like he belonged. The lobby security guard, a guy named Pete who'd barely acknowledged Daniel's existence during 3 years of night shifts, looked up in surprise. "Danny, what are you doing here during the day?" "Meeting," Daniel said, trying to sound casual. "Meeting?" Pete's eyebrows shot up. "With who?" "Mrs. Grant." Pete's jaw dropped. "Isabella Grant, the Isabella Grant." "Yeah. Holy shit, Danny. What did you do?" That was the million-dollar question, wasn't it? What had he done saved her life, yes. But that was just human decency. Had a conversation about engineering, but that hardly seemed earth-shattering. Yet here he was riding the elevator up 32 floors to discover what the most powerful woman in Chicago wanted from a nighttime janitor. The 32nd floor was a world Daniel had never seen during his cleaning rounds. This was strategy level where the real decisions got made. The hallways were wider, the artwork more expensive, the silence more profound. Even the air felt different, thinner, more rarefied, charged with the electricity of power and money. Conference Room B was at the end of a hallway lined with portraits of the Grant Industries Board of Directors, stern-faced men and women who looked like they could buy and sell small countries before lunch. Daniel paused outside the door, his hand hovering over the handle, seized by the sudden certainty that this was a mistake. Then he thought about Lily, about the field trip permission slip still sitting on his dresser, about the way her face had fallen when he'd given her another non-answer about whether he could come, about the way she'd asked if he'd ever get a job that made him smile with his eyes. Daniel opened the door. The conference room was massive, dominated by a mahogany table that could have seated 20 people. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Chicago, the city sprawling out below like a circuit board made of steel and glass. At the far end of the table sat Isabella Grant, looking perfectly at home in her power suit and the rarefied air of executive decision-making. She wasn't alone. A man in his 50s sat to her right, his gray hair perfectly styled, his suit probably worth more than Daniel's car. He had the kind of face that belonged on magazine covers, all sharp angles and confident lines. When he looked up at Daniel, his expression was politely neutral, but Daniel caught something else underneath. Skepticism, maybe, or amusement. "Mr. Cross," Isabella said, standing. "Thank you for coming. I'd like you to meet James Morrison, our Chief Technology Officer." Morrison stood and extended his hand. His grip was firm, professional, the handshake of a man who'd spent decades in boardrooms. "Mr. Cross, Isabella's told me about your background." The way he said background made it sound like a criminal record. "Please sit," Isabella said, gesturing to a chair across from them. "Can I get you coffee, water?" "Coffee would be great," Daniel said, settling into the leather chair and trying not to think about how much it probably cost. More than he made in a month, certainly. Isabella pressed a button on the conference phone. Margaret, could you bring in coffee for 3, please? Within minutes, a woman in her 30s appeared with a silver service that looked like it belonged in a palace. She poured coffee into bone china cups that probably cost more than Daniel's grocery budget, then disappeared as silently as she'd arrived. Mr. Cross, Isabella said, settling back into her chair. I've been thinking about our conversation Friday night. About your work with water filtration systems. Okay, Daniel said carefully. James here leads our infrastructure division. We've been working on a project that might interest you. Isabella slid a folder across the table. Take a look. Daniel opened the folder and felt his breath catch. The documents inside detailed a water purification initiative for rural communities in developing nations, exactly the kind of work he'd been passionate about before his world collapsed. The technical specifications were impressive, the scope ambitious, the potential impact staggering. It was also deeply flawed. Daniel read through the engineering schematics, his trained eye immediately spotting the problems. The filtration system was over-engineered, requiring maintenance protocols that rural communities couldn't support. The power requirements assumed grid electricity that wouldn't be available in most target locations. The cost per unit was astronomical. What do you think? Morrison asked, watching Daniel's face carefully. Daniel looked up from the documents, aware that his next words might determine the direction of this conversation. He could play it safe, offer vague compliments, avoid stepping on the toes of people who could crush him without a second thought. Instead, he chose honesty. It's brilliant work, Daniel said, but it won't work in the field. Morrison's expression hardened. Excuse me. The design assumes infrastructure that doesn't exist in the communities you're targeting. Daniel explained, warming to the subject despite the tension in the room. Grid power trained technicians regular supply chains for replacement parts. Most villages in rural Africa or South America don't have any of that. Our engineers spent 18 months on this project, Morrison said coldly. They considered every variable. I'm sure they did, Daniel replied. But there's a difference between considering variables on paper and living with them in the field. I've been there. I've seen brilliant designs fail because they didn't account for reality. Isabella leaned forward, her green eyes intent. What would you do differently? Daniel felt a familiar fire kindle in his chest, the same passion that had once driven him to work impossible hours, because the work itself mattered. He turned to a fresh page in the folder and began sketching his hands, moving with the muscle memory of a man who'd once lived and breathed engineering solutions. Solar power integration here, he said, drawing quickly. Not grid-dependent works in remote locations. Modular filtration system here. If one component fails, the whole system doesn't go down. Local sourcing for replacement materials wherever possible. As he drew, Daniel felt himself coming alive in a way he hadn't in 3 years. This was who he'd been before grief and desperation had forced him into invisibility. This was the man Sarah had fallen in love with, the father Lily deserved to have. The key is simplicity, he continued, filling in details on his rough sketch. You want something a village mechanic can fix with basic tools, not something that requires a PhD to maintain. When he looked up, Morrison was staring at the sketch with something that might have been surprise. Isabella was smiling. How long would it take you to develop a working prototype? She asked. Daniel blinked. I'm sorry. A working prototype, Isabella repeated. Based on your design modifications. How long? I'm a janitor, Daniel said weakly. No, Isabella said firmly. You're an engineer who's been working as a janitor. There's a difference. Morrison cleared his throat. Isabella, with all due respect, we can't just hand over a multi-million-dollar project to someone who actually knows what he's talking about. Isabella cut him off. James, your team has been spinning its wheels on this for 18 months. Mr. Cross just identified the core problems in 15 minutes. He identified some potential issues, Morrison corrected. That doesn't mean... It means he understands the real-world applications better than anyone in your department, Isabella said. Her voice was still polite, but there was steel underneath, which is exactly what this project needs. Daniel sat frozen, watching this exchange between two of the most powerful people he'd ever met, trying to process what was happening. Were they actually considering giving him a janitor a role in a major engineering project? Mrs. Grant, Daniel said carefully, I appreciate the opportunity, but I haven't practiced engineering in 3 years. I don't have the resources, the equipment, the team support. You'd have all of that, Isabella said. Full access to our research and development facilities. A team of junior engineers to support the build process. Whatever budget you need for materials and testing. And if it doesn't work, Isabella smiled, then we'll be exactly where we are now, with a brilliant design that doesn't function in the real world. But if it does work, she gestured to the documents in front of Daniel. This project could provide clean water to 50 million people over the next decade. 50 million people who are currently drinking contaminated water, getting sick, dying from preventable diseases. Daniel thought about the villages he and Sarah had worked in, the children who'd walked miles every day to fetch water from polluted rivers, the mothers who'd watched their babies die from dysentery because clean water was a luxury they couldn't afford. How long do I have to think about it? He asked. You don't, Morrison interjected. This is insane, Isabella. We can't restructure a major project based on a conversation with the man who saved my life. Isabella's voice was dangerously quiet. The man whose engineering insights just solved problems your team couldn't crack in 18 months. Morrison fell silent, but Daniel could see the resentment simmering behind his professional facade. This was politics, he realized. Office dynamics and territorial disputes and egos bruised by the suggestion that an outsider might succeed where insiders had failed. There would be conditions, Isabella continued, as if Morrison hadn't spoken. You'd work directly under my supervision initially. Report on progress weekly. If the prototype doesn't meet specifications within 6 months, we reassess. And my current job, you'd transition to full-time engineering consultant, salary commensurate with your experience and the project's importance. Daniel's mind raced through the implications. A real engineering job, decent money, the chance to do work that mattered again. The opportunity to be the kind of father Lily deserved, present for field trips, proud of his work, smiling with his eyes. But it also meant stepping back into the light, abandoning the safety of invisibility, risking failure on a scale that could destroy not just his own life, but the lives of the 50 million people Isabella had mentioned. Can I ask you something? Daniel said finally. Of course. Why me? You could hire any engineering firm in the world for this project. You could poach talent from MIT, from Stanford, from anywhere. Why offer this to a janitor you barely know? Isabella was quiet for a long moment, her green eyes studying his face with that same intensity he remembered from the hospital. When she spoke, her voice was softer than he'd heard it. Do you know what my company's mission statement is, Mr. Cross? Daniel nodded. He'd read it countless times during his cleaning rounds. It was engraved on a plaque in the lobby. Engineering solutions that improve lives and build sustainable communities. My father wrote that mission statement 30 years ago, Isabella said. But somewhere along the way, we stopped focusing on the improve lives part and started caring more about quarterly earnings and stock prices. We became very good at engineering profitable solutions for wealthy clients and very bad at remembering why we got into this business in the first place. She gestured to Morrison's folder. This project is supposed to change that. Get us back to our roots, back to the work that actually matters. But every design my team produces is infected with the same disease they're engineering for the life they know, not the lives that need help. Isabella leaned forward, her intensity palpable. You've lived in both worlds, Mr. Cross. You've worked in villages where children die from preventable diseases, and you've spent 3 years cleaning toilets to support your daughter. You understand both the engineering challenges and the human cost of failure. That doesn't make me qualified to lead a 50 million person initiative, Daniel said. No, Isabella agreed, but it makes you qualified to design something that will actually work, something that will save lives instead of just looking good in a boardroom presentation. Morrison shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Isabella, I understand the appeal of this narrative. The janitor who becomes the hero, the underdog who saves the day. But we have responsibilities to our shareholders, to our board of directors. We can't base major business decisions on feel-good stories. Isabella's expression hardened. James, this isn't a feel-good story. This is about finding solutions that work. Your team has had 18 months and unlimited resources, and they've produced a system that would fail within 6 months of deployment. Mr. Cross identified the core problems in 15 minutes. Identifying problems is different from solving them, Morrison shot back. Then let's find out which one he can do, Isabella said. She turned back to Daniel. 6 months. Full resources and support. If your prototype works, we move to production. If it doesn't, you go back to your old life with a substantial severance package and our thanks for trying. Daniel stared at the documents in front of him, his rough sketches sitting beside Morrison's polished technical drawings like hope sitting next to despair. 6 months to prove he was still the engineer he used to be. 6 months to step back into the light and risk everything. He thought about Sarah, about the dreams they'd shared of bringing clean water to communities that needed it most. About Lily asking if he'd ever get a job that made him smile with his eyes. About the 50 million people whose lives might depend on whether he was brave enough to stop being invisible. There's one more condition, Daniel said finally. Isabella raised an eyebrow. Yes. If this works, if the prototype succeeds and we move to production, I want to be part of the deployment team. I want to go back to the field, see these systems installed, make sure they actually do what we're promising they'll do. Morrison snorted. That's not how done. Isabella cut him off. Anything else? Daniel shook his head, not trusting himself to speak. The magnitude of what was happening was starting to sink in. This morning he'd been a janitor wondering how to pay for his daughter's field trip. Now he was potentially the lead engineer on a project that could change millions of lives. Excellent, Isabella said, standing. James, please have your team prepare a full technical briefing for Mr. Cross. I want him up to speed on all current research by Wednesday. Morrison's jaw was tight, but he nodded. Of course. Mr. Cross, you'll start Thursday. Margaret will coordinate office space and equipment needs. Isabella extended her hand. Welcome to Grant Industries. Again. Daniel shook her hand, feeling the calluses on his palms, evidence of 3 years spent mopping floors and emptying trash cans against her soft skin. In 6 months, maybe those calluses would be gone, replaced by the softer hands of someone who worked with his mind instead of his back. Or maybe he'd fail spectacularly and end up exactly where he'd started, invisible and broke and wondering what might have been. As he left the conference room and walked back toward the elevator, Daniel's phone buzzed with a text message. Lily's teacher reminding him about the Science Museum field trip permission slip. For the first time in 3 years, Daniel smiled as he typed back his response. Lily will be there, and so will I. The elevator doors closed, carrying him down from the 32nd floor toward a ground level that suddenly looked very different than it had an hour ago. Through the windows, Chicago sprawled out below 8 million people going about their lives, most of them taking clean water for granted, never thinking about the engineering marvels that made their comfortable existence possible. By Thursday, Daniel would be one of the people responsible for extending that comfort to parts of the world where clean water was still a dream. The invisible janitor was about to become very visible indeed. The only question was whether he was ready for the light. Thursday morning found Daniel standing outside Grant Industries at 7:30 a.m. wearing the same blue shirt he'd worn to Monday's meeting and carrying a leather briefcase Sarah had given him during their first year of marriage. Inside the briefcase were his old engineering notebooks filled with sketches and calculations from a life that felt simultaneously like yesterday and a lifetime ago. The security guard Pete grinned when he saw him approaching. Well, look who's moving up in the world. Heard you're working with the big shots now. Something like that, Daniel said, still not quite believing it himself. Good for you, Danny. Always thought you were too smart to be pushing a mop your whole life. The comment stuck with Daniel as he rode the elevator to the 15th floor, where Margaret Isabella's assistant had arranged his temporary office. Too smart to be pushing a mop. But intelligence without opportunity was just potential energy waiting for the right catalyst. Isabella Grant had become that catalyst, and now Daniel had to prove he was worth the investment. His office was small but functional, with a drafting table, a computer loaded with engineering software, and windows that looked out over the Chicago River. It wasn't much, but it was more space than he'd had to call his own in 3 years. On the desk, Margaret had left a stack of technical documents. Morrison's complete research files and a note from Isabella. Looking forward to seeing what you build. IG. Daniel had barely settled into his chair when someone knocked on his doorframe. A woman in her early 30s stood there holding 2 coffee cups and wearing the kind of nervous smile that suggested she'd been volunteered for a task she wasn't entirely comfortable with. Mr. Cross, I'm Dr. Elena Vasquez, Chemical Engineering. Mr. Morrison asked me to brief you on our current research. Please call me Daniel, he said, accepting the coffee gratefully. And thank you for this. I have a feeling I'm going to need all the caffeine I can get. Elena laughed, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. That's what I told my team when Mr. Morrison told us we'd be supporting your project. Half of them think this is exciting, the other half think it's crazy. Which half are you in? Both, Elena said honestly. Can I ask you something? Sure. Is it true you've been working as a janitor here for 3 years? Daniel nodded. Night shift. Probably cleaned your office a few dozen times. Elena shook her head in amazement. And now you're leading a $50 million water purification project. It's like something out of a movie. Let's hope it has a better ending than most movies about underdogs taking on impossible challenges, Daniel said dryly. Elena spread out the technical documents on his desk. Okay, let me walk you through what we've got so far. For the next 3 hours, Elena took Daniel through every aspect of Morrison's team's research. The filtration chemistry, the power systems, the manufacturing processes, the cost projections. It was impressive work, thorough, well-researched, technically sophisticated, and completely impractical for the real world. The membrane technology is brilliant, Daniel said, studying the molecular diagrams. But what happens when it clogs? How do you clean it without specialized solvents? We assumed communities would have access to our maintenance protocols, Elena said, which assume what trucks delivering chemical cleaning agents to villages that don't have roads. Trained technicians who can handle hazardous materials in communities that don't have hospitals. Elena was quiet for a moment. When you put it that way, it does sound unrealistic. It's not unrealistic, Daniel corrected. It's just designed for a different world than the one that needs it. Tell me about the power requirements. Grid electrical with battery backup, Elena said. The system draws about 15 kilowatts during peak filtration cycles. Daniel nearly choked on his coffee. 15 kilowatts, Elena. Most of the communities we're targeting don't have electrical grids. The ones that do have maybe 5 kilowatts of total generating capacity for the entire village. We did discuss solar integration, Elena said defensively. How much solar capacity would you need to generate 15 kilowatts? Elena pulled out her calculator, her fingers flying over the keys. Assuming 8 hours of peak sun per day, about 60 kilowatts of solar panels, which would cost around $90,000, plus batteries for overnight operation. Daniel leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. So we're asking villages where the average annual income is maybe $300 per person to invest $90,000 in solar panels, plus whatever the filtration system costs, plus ongoing maintenance and replacement parts. When you put it like that, it sounds insane, Daniel finished. Because it is insane. We're engineering a Rolls-Royce for people who need a bicycle. Elena nodded slowly, and Daniel could see her processing the implications. She was a good engineer, technically competent, analytically sharp, but she'd spent her career in laboratories and research facilities designing solutions for problems described in academic papers rather than experienced firsthand. So what do we do differently? She asked. Daniel turned to a fresh sheet of paper and began sketching. We start with constraints instead of capabilities. What can we assume about the communities we're serving? No grid power. No trained technicians, no reliable supply chains, limited financial resources. But they do have sunlight. They do have basic mechanical skills, and they do have powerful motivation to make clean water systems work. As he drew, Daniel felt the familiar fire of engineering passion kindling in his chest. This was the work he'd been born to do, taking impossible problems and finding elegant solutions, designing systems that worked not because they were sophisticated, but because they were simple. Solar, but low power, he said, sketching a compact panel array. Maybe 200 watts maximum. Gravity feed instead of electric pumps. Modular design so components can be repaired or replaced individually. Local materials wherever possible. What about filtration capacity? Elena asked, watching his sketch take shape. We optimize for efficiency, not volume. Better to have a system that produces 50 gallons of clean water per day reliably than one that produces 500 gallons when everything works perfectly and nothing when it doesn't. Elena leaned forward, studying his design. The membrane system would have to be completely different. Lower pressure, probably multiple stages. Exactly. And we design it so the membranes can be cleaned with materials available locally, sand, charcoal, basic acids, and bases. That would require extensive testing, Elena said. We'd have to validate the cleaning protocols, test membrane longevity, ensure water quality standards are maintained. Which is why we build prototypes, Daniel said. Test them here under controlled conditions, then test them in the field under real conditions. They worked through lunch, Elena bringing in other members of Morrison's team as they tackled different aspects of the design challenge. By mid-afternoon, Daniel's office was crowded with engineers, all of them sketching variations on his basic concept, debating technical trade-offs, calculating power requirements, and filtration rates. It felt like the old days, the time before Sarah got sick, when engineering was a collaborative art form, and every problem was just a puzzle waiting to be solved. Daniel had forgotten how much he missed this, the electricity of minds working together toward a common goal. "What about manufacturing?" asked Dr. Patel, a mechanical engineer who specialized in production systems. "If we're talking about 50 million people, we're looking at maybe 10,000 units. How do we scale production while keeping costs down?" "We don't manufacture centrally," Daniel said. "We license the design to regional manufacturers, provide technical specifications and quality standards, but let local companies handle production and distribution." "That introduces quality control issues," Patel warned. "It also creates local jobs and reduces transportation costs," Daniel countered. "And if we design the system simply enough, quality control becomes less critical. The best engineering solution is one that works even when it's built imperfectly." The afternoon flew by in a blur of calculations and debates and incremental breakthroughs. By 5 o'clock, they had the skeleton of a completely different approach, simpler, cheaper, more robust than Morrison's original design, but potentially much more effective in real-world conditions. "This is good work," Elena said as the team began packing up. "Really good. I haven't been this excited about a project in years." "It's just the beginning," Daniel warned. "The real work starts when we try to build it." After the others left, Daniel sat alone in his office, staring at the sketches and calculations that covered every available surface. 6 months ago, these same problems had seemed insurmountable. Technical challenges wrapped in economic constraints, wrapped in political complications. Now they felt like puzzles again, difficult, but solvable. His phone buzzed with a text from Lily. "How was your first day at your new job? Are you smiling with your eyes yet?" Daniel looked at his reflection in the window, surprised to discover that yes, he was smiling. Not the forced smile he'd worn for 3 years while pushing mops and emptying trash cans, but the genuine expression of someone doing work that mattered. He was still admiring his reflection when Isabella Grant appeared in his doorway. "How did it go?" she asked, surveying the chaos of papers and empty coffee cups. "Better than expected," Daniel said. "Your team is good, really good. They just needed to think about the problem from a different angle." Isabella stepped into the office, examining his sketches with the focused attention of someone who understood engineering principles. "Walk me through it." For the next hour, Daniel explained their revised approach, the simplified design, the reduced power requirements, the local manufacturing strategy. Isabella asked sharp questions that proved she wasn't just a CEO who'd inherited her position, but an engineer who understood the technical challenges at a fundamental level. "What's your confidence level?" she asked when he'd finished. "In the basic design, high. In our ability to execute it. That depends on a lot of variables we can't control, such as field conditions, local politics, supply chain reliability, whether communities will actually adopt and maintain the systems once they're installed." Daniel paused. "And whether Morrison's team will support a complete redesign of their 18-month project." Isabella's expression hardened slightly. "Let me worry about James. Your job is to build something that works. And if I can't, then we'll be exactly where we were a week ago with a brilliant design that doesn't function in the real world. But if you succeed," Isabella gestured to his sketches, 50 million people get access to clean water, and Grant Industries remembers why we got into this business." After Isabella left, Daniel worked until nearly midnight, refining calculations and sketching design variations. It felt natural to be working late again, driven by the kind of passionate focus he hadn't experienced in 3 years. When he finally drove home, Chicago looked different through his windshield, not like a city that had trapped him in poverty and invisibility, but like a place where miracles might actually be possible. The next morning brought Daniel's first real test. Morrison had called a team meeting to review the preliminary design changes, and Daniel could sense the tension the moment he walked into the conference room. Morrison sat at the head of the table flanked by his senior engineers, all of them wearing the careful expressions of people preparing for battle. "Mr. Cross," Morrison said coolly, "I understand you've been making some modifications to our research." "Exploring alternative approaches," Daniel corrected, "based on real-world constraints that might not have been fully considered in the original design." "Real-world constraints," Morrison repeated. "You mean the constraints of communities that can't afford proper infrastructure?" "I mean the constraints of communities that need solutions they can actually implement and maintain," Daniel said, keeping his voice level. Dr. Patel shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "James, we spent yesterday working through some interesting possibilities. The simplified design has real potential." "The simplified design," Morrison said, "abandons 18 months of research and development in favor of what the intuitions of someone who hasn't practiced engineering in 3 years." The room fell silent. Daniel felt the familiar weight of imposter syndrome settling over him like a heavy coat. Morrison was right. He was a janitor, playing engineer, presuming to redesign a project that real professionals had been working on for months. But then he thought about Sarah, about the villages they'd worked in, about children walking miles every day for contaminated water, while brilliant engineers designed systems those children would never be able to use. "You're right," Daniel said finally. "I haven't practiced engineering in 3 years, but I've spent those 3 years learning what it means to live without resources, to make impossible choices, to find solutions that work with what you have instead of what you wish you had." He stood and walked to the whiteboard, picking up a marker. "Your design assumes communities have 15 kilowatts of reliable power. Let me show you what 15 kilowatts means to a village in rural Guatemala." Daniel began drawing his marker, moving across the board in quick, confident strokes. A simple diagram of a typical village, 30 families, maybe 150 people total. A small generator that provided power to essential services a few hours each day. "This is San Miguel, a village I worked in 6 years ago," Daniel continued. "Population 147. Their generator produces 5 kilowatts on a good day. They use it to power their medical clinic from 6 to 9 p.m., their school from 7 to 11 a.m., and their community center for evening meetings." He turned back to face the room. "Your system would require them to triple their electrical capacity just to run water purification. That means choosing between clean water and medical care, between clean water and education. It's not a technical decision, it's a moral one." Morrison's jaw was tight. "So you're saying our entire approach is wrong?" "I'm saying your approach solves the wrong problem," Daniel replied. "You're designing for the communities you wish existed instead of the communities that actually need help. And your approach is better." Daniel turned back to the whiteboard, erasing his village diagram and beginning a new sketch. "My approach assumes that elegance comes from simplicity, not sophistication. That the best solution is one that works reliably with minimal resources and basic maintenance." As he drew, Daniel felt the familiar fire of passionate conviction. This was why he'd become an engineer, not to build impressive systems that showcased technical prowess, but to solve real problems for real people. Solar panels here, 200 watts, enough to run a small pump and charging system. Gravity-fed filtration using locally available materials. Modular design so components can be repaired or replaced individually. Total power requirement less than 1 kilowatt. Cost per unit under $5,000 instead of $50,000. He finished the sketch and turned back to the room. "It's not as sophisticated as your design. It doesn't process as much water per hour. But it works reliably, it's maintainable by local technicians, and it's affordable for communities that need it most." The room was quiet for a long moment. Dr. Vasquez was studying the sketch with obvious interest. Dr. Patel was taking notes. Even Morrison seemed to be considering the implications. "It would require completely starting over," Morrison said finally. "Not starting over," Daniel corrected. "Building on the foundation you've already created. Your membrane chemistry is brilliant. We just need to adapt it for lower pressure operation. Your filtration algorithms are excellent. We just need to optimize them for different flow rates. The timeline stays the same, 6 months to working prototype. But instead of debugging an over-engineered system, we spend that time testing a design that's built to work from day one." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming on the conference table. Daniel could see the internal struggle, professional pride warring with practical considerations, the difficulty of abandoning work he'd invested 18 months in developing. "Isabella wants this to succeed," Morrison said finally. "We all want this to succeed," Daniel replied. "The question is whether we're willing to let go of perfect to achieve good enough." "Good enough doesn't win engineering awards," Morrison said. "No," Daniel agreed, "but it saves lives." The meeting ended without a clear resolution, but Daniel could sense the shift in momentum. Elena and Patel were already discussing implementation details. Other team members were asking technical questions about the simplified design. Morrison remained skeptical, but his resistance was weakening in the face of mounting evidence that Daniel's approach might actually work. Over the following weeks, Daniel threw himself into the project with an intensity that reminded him of his early days with Sarah. 18-hour days became routine as he refined the design, built computer models, tested component interactions under simulated field conditions. The work was challenging, demanding, exhausting, and absolutely exhilarating. Elena became his closest collaborator, her expertise in membrane chemistry, complementing his systems engineering background. Together, they solved the filtration pressure problem, developing a multi-stage process that achieved the same purification levels as Morrison's original design, while operating at 1/10 the power requirement. Dr. Patel took on the mechanical engineering challenges, designing pumps and valves that could be manufactured locally and repaired with basic tools. His enthusiasm for the project was infectious. He stayed late most nights sketching variations and testing components, with the passionate focus of someone who'd rediscovered why he'd become an engineer. Even Morrison gradually warmed to the revised approach, his initial skepticism giving way to professional interest as the design took shape. He never explicitly endorsed the project, but he stopped actively opposing it, and his team began contributing ideas and expertise with increasing enthusiasm. The breakthrough came on a rainy Tuesday in November, 6 weeks into the project. Daniel had been struggling with the power management system, trying to balance solar charging rates with filtration demands while maintaining enough battery capacity for overnight operation. The mathematics were elegant, but the practical implementation kept failing, too expensive, too complicated, too dependent on components that wouldn't be available in remote locations. He was staring at his calculations, exhausted and frustrated, when Lily's words from months ago echoed in his mind. "Daddy, why do you look sad in the mornings?" The answer had been that he'd forgotten how to smile with his eyes, forgotten what it felt like to do work that mattered, to solve problems that actually helped people. But sitting in his office at 11 p.m., surrounded by sketches and prototypes and the accumulated debris of passionate effort, Daniel realized he was smiling again. More importantly, he was thinking like an engineer again. Daniel erased his power management calculations and started over. But this time he began with a different question. Instead of asking how to optimize the system for maximum efficiency, he asked how to design it for maximum forgiveness. What if the solar panels got dirty? What if the batteries degraded? What if the local technician made a mistake during maintenance? The solution came to him in a flash of insight so clear, it felt like divine inspiration. Instead of one sophisticated power management system, he'd use three simple ones, redundant, independent, each capable of running the filtration system at reduced capacity. If one failed, the others would compensate. If two failed, the system would still produce some clean water instead of none. By morning, Daniel had a complete design for what he privately called the bulletproof filtration system. It wasn't the most efficient solution. Engineering purists would probably call it wasteful, but it was robust, maintainable, and would continue working even when everything went wrong. Which in Daniel's experience, everything always did. When he presented the final design to Isabella 3 weeks later, Daniel felt the same nervous excitement he'd experienced before proposing to Sarah. This was it, the culmination of everything he'd learned, everything he'd suffered, through everything he'd rebuilt from the ashes of his former life. "It's not the prettiest system ever designed," he said, walking Isabella through the technical specifications. "It's not the most efficient, it's not the most sophisticated, but it works. And it keeps working when other systems fail." Isabella studied the design documents with the same focused intensity she'd shown during their first conversation. "What's the failure rate?" "In lab conditions, less than 2% over 5 years. In field conditions, we're estimating maybe 8%. But with graceful degradation, even failed systems continue producing some clean water." "Cost per unit?" $4,800 including solar panels and 5 years of replacement parts. Isabella looked up from the documents. James estimated $53,000 for his design. James was designing a Ferrari. "This is more like a Toyota, not as flashy, but it'll run for 200,000 miles with basic maintenance." Isabella smiled, and Daniel saw something in her expression he hadn't seen before, not just approval, but genuine excitement. "When can we start building prototypes?" "Elena's team has been fabricating components for the past month. We could have working units ready for testing in 3 weeks." "And field testing?" Daniel felt his heart rate accelerate. This was the moment he'd been working toward, the chance to take his designs back into the real world, to see whether his theories could survive contact with actual communities and actual problems. "I'd recommend starting with 3 pilot communities," he said. "Different geographic regions, different economic conditions, different technical capabilities. Install systems, train local operators, monitor performance for 6 months." "Where?" Daniel had been thinking about this question for weeks. "Guatemala, Kenya, and the Philippines. I have contacts in all 3 locations from my previous work. Communities that need clean water systems and are willing to work with us on testing and refinement." Isabella nodded slowly. "That would mean travel, extended field assignments." "Yes. You'd be away from your daughter for months at a time." Daniel's throat tightened. This was the choice he'd been dreading, between the work that gave his life meaning and the daughter who was his entire world. But maybe for the first time in 3 years, he didn't have to choose. "Actually," Daniel said, "I was hoping Lily could come with me, at least for some of the assignments. She could do remote schooling, and it would be educational for her to see different cultures, different approaches to solving problems." Isabella raised an eyebrow. "You want to bring a 6-year-old to remote villages in developing countries?" "I want to show my daughter what it looks like when engineering actually helps people," Daniel said. "She spent 3 years watching me push mops and empty trash cans. Maybe it's time she saw what I was meant to do." Isabella was quiet for a long moment, and Daniel could see her weighing the practical complications against the human considerations. Finally, she smiled. "Mr. Cross," she said, "you've just convinced me that we're backing the right engineer for this project." 3 weeks later, Daniel stood in Grant Industries' prototype laboratory, watching Elena's team conduct final tests on the first complete water purification unit. The system was smaller than Morrison's original design, about the size of a large refrigerator, but it represented everything Daniel had learned about building solutions that actually worked in the real world. The test results were perfect. Water quality exceeded WHO standards, power consumption stayed within acceptable parameters, and the system had run continuously for 72 hours without any maintenance interventions. "It's ready," Elena said, grinning at the printouts from the monitoring equipment. Daniel nodded, but his mind was already racing ahead to the real test, taking these systems into communities that needed them, training local operators, watching his theories survive contact with reality. In 2 weeks, he and Lily would board a plane for Guatemala carrying blueprints and hope and the accumulated wisdom of a man who'd learned to smile with his eyes again. The invisible janitor was about to become very visible indeed, and the world would never look the same. The airplane engines hummed steadily as Daniel watched the Chicago skyline shrink beneath them, taking with it the last vestiges of his invisible life. Beside him, Lily pressed her face against the window, her eyes wide with wonder at her first flight. She clutched a small notebook Isabella had given her for recording your scientific observations, Isabella had said, with a smile that suggested she understood exactly what this journey meant to both father and daughter. "Daddy, are we really going to help people get clean water?" Lily asked, her breath fogging the airplane window. "We're going to try, sweetheart," Daniel said, adjusting her seatbelt as the plane banked toward the south. Sometimes trying is the most important part. The 3 prototype units were secured in the cargo hold below them, each one representing months of calculations and testing, and the accumulated hope of everyone who'd worked on the project. Elena had insisted on coming along for the initial installation, bringing with her a determination to see their laboratory work translated into real-world results. Morrison had surprised everyone by volunteering for the second deployment to Kenya. His initial skepticism transformed into genuine investment in the project's success. But Guatemala was Daniel's responsibility, his chance to prove that the invisible janitor had truly become the engineer he'd once been. San Miguel de Agua sat in a valley 40 miles northeast of Guatemala City, accessible only by a dirt road that turned to mud whenever it rained. Daniel had worked there 6 years ago during the last project he'd completed with Sarah. The village had grown since then, maybe 200 people now, instead of 150, but the fundamental challenges remained unchanged. No electrical grid, no reliable transportation, no access to clean water, except for a contaminated well that made half the children sick every rainy season. The bus ride from Guatemala City took 4 hours over roads that would have challenged a military vehicle. Lily handled the journey better than Daniel had expected, chattering excitedly with Elena about the engineering principles behind suspension systems and asking perceptive questions about why some vehicles handled rough roads better than others. "She's going to be an engineer," Elena said quietly to Daniel as they bounced through another pothole. "Sarah always said she would be," Daniel replied, watching his daughter sketch the mountain scenery in her notebook. "Said Lily had the kind of curiosity that doesn't accept easy answers." "Like her father." Daniel smiled. "Sarah was the one with real vision. I just figured out how to build the things she dreamed up." But even as he said it, Daniel knew that wasn't entirely true anymore. The water purification system strapped to the roof of their bus was his design, born from his understanding of both engineering principles and human limitations. For the first time in his career, he was the one with the vision. They reached San Miguel just as the sun was setting over the mountains, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber that took Daniel's breath away. The village looked exactly as he remembered: small houses with corrugated metal roofs, Children playing soccer in a dusty field, women carrying water jugs from the communal well that served as the community's primary source of drinking water. Miguel Santos, the village's elected leader, greeted them with the kind of cautious optimism Daniel remembered from his previous work in rural communities. Santos was in his 50s, weathered by decades of hard work and harder choices, but his eyes held the intelligence of someone who'd learned to evaluate promises carefully. "Señor Cross," Santos said in accented English, shaking Daniel's hand warmly. "We remember you and your wife. The small purification systems you installed still work." "I'm glad to hear that," Daniel said, surprised by how much the acknowledgement meant to him. "This is my daughter Lily and my colleague Dr. Vasquez. We're here to install something much bigger than what Sarah and I brought before." Santos nodded gravely. "The children still get sick from the well water, especially during the rainy season. If your new system can help, that's what we're here to find out." They spent the evening in Santos's home sharing a simple meal of beans and rice and fresh tortillas, while Daniel explained the new filtration system. Santos translated for the other village leaders, and Daniel watched their faces carefully as they processed the implications. These were people who'd been disappointed by promises before aid workers and government officials and well-meaning foreigners who'd arrived with solutions that didn't work or couldn't be maintained. "The solar panels," Santos said finally. "What happens when they break?" "They're designed not to break," Elena said. "But if they do, any of the replacement panels we'll provide can substitute. And the system will still work with reduced power, it just produces less water per day." "And the filters?" "We'll train local technicians to maintain them," Daniel said, "using materials you can source here in Guatemala. No waiting for parts from the United States." Santos nodded slowly. "And if the whole system fails?" Daniel had been expecting this question. It was the heart of every conversation he'd had with community leaders over the years. People in rural villages had learned to be skeptical of complex solutions because complexity usually meant vulnerability. "Then we fix it," Daniel said simply. "Elena and I aren't leaving until we're confident the system works and your people know how to maintain it. And if something goes wrong after we leave, we come back." Santos translated this for the other leaders, and Daniel caught the shift in their expressions from polite interest to genuine engagement. These weren't empty promises from another well-meaning outsider. This was a commitment from someone who understood the stakes. The next morning, Daniel woke before dawn to find Lily already up sitting on the small porch of the house where they were staying and sketching the village in her notebook. She'd captured not just the physical details, but something essential about the place, the way morning light filtered through the mountains, the sense of community that came from people who'd learned to depend on each other. "It's beautiful here," she said when she noticed him watching. "It is," Daniel agreed. "But beautiful places can still have big problems. Like the water. Like the water." Lily was quiet for a moment, then looked up at him with Sarah's eyes. "Is this why you became sad after Mommy died? Because you stopped helping people?" The question hit Daniel like a physical blow. In 6 years of marriage and 3 years of single parenthood, no one had ever asked him such a direct question about his choices. Not Isabella, not Elena, not the therapists he'd briefly seen after Sarah's death. "I didn't stop helping people," Daniel said carefully. "I just started helping them in a different way. Cleaning buildings helps the people who work in them." "But it doesn't make you smile with your eyes." Daniel looked at his daughter, Shelley looked at her, and saw not just Sarah's features, but Sarah's insight, the ability to see through comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. "No," he said quietly. "It didn't make me smile with my eyes. And this does." Daniel thought about the 3 months he'd spent designing the filtration system, the 18-hour days that had felt like play, because the work itself was a form of worship. He thought about Elena's excitement when they'd solved the pressure differential problem, about Morrison's grudging respect when the prototype had exceeded all performance specifications. "Yes," he said, "this does." The installation took 3 days, partly because of the technical challenges, but mostly because Daniel insisted on involving as many community members as possible in the process. This wasn't just about installing equipment, it was about transferring knowledge, building local capacity, ensuring that the village could maintain and repair the system long after he and Elena returned to Chicago. Santos had identified 3 men with mechanical aptitude to serve as primary operators. Carlos, a carpenter who'd built half the houses in the village, Roberto, who maintained the community's small generator, and Miguel Santos's nephew, who had a natural intuition for how complex systems worked. "The most important thing," Daniel told them as they assembled the solar panel array, "is understanding that this system wants to work. We designed it to be forgiving. If you make a small mistake, it will keep running. If you make a big mistake, it will shut down safely instead of breaking." Carlos nodded, his hands already familiar with the modular design that allowed components to be easily removed and replaced. "Like building a house. If one board is bad, you replace the board. You don't tear down the house." "Exactly like that," Daniel said, impressed by how quickly Carlos had grasped the principle. Elena worked with the women of the village, training them to test water quality and recognize signs that the system needed maintenance. She'd brought simple testing kits that could detect bacterial contamination and chemical impurities, tools that were sophisticated enough to be reliable but simple enough to be used by people without technical training. "The water should always be clear," she explained to Maria Santos, Miguel's wife. "If it becomes cloudy or develops an odor, that means the filters need attention." "And if we cannot fix it ourselves?" Maria asked. "Then you call us," Elena said, handing her a satellite phone programmed with Grant Industries' emergency number. "Someone will always answer, and if necessary, someone will come." On the 3rd day, they activated the system for the first time. Daniel stood beside the control panel, his hand hovering over the startup button, feeling the weight of months of work and dreams and the hopes of 200 people who needed clean water. "Ready?" he asked Santos. "Ready," Santos replied. Daniel pressed the button, and the system hummed to life with a sound that was both mechanical and musical. The sound of engineering principles becoming physical reality. Solar panels began converting sunlight to electricity, pumps began moving water through the filtration stages, and a display panel showed the system's vital signs in real time. For 30 minutes, nothing happened. The system ran through its startup sequence, testing components and optimizing flow rates, while the entire village gathered around the output spigot, waiting for the first drops of purified water. Then, with a soft hiss of escaping air, clear water began flowing from the tap. The cheer that went up from the crowd was unlike anything Daniel had experienced in his engineering career. Children laughed and splashed in the stream of clean water. Adults filled cups and tasted the difference, and several of the older women began crying tears of relief for a problem that had plagued their community for generations. Santos filled a glass and handed it to Daniel. "The first cup belongs to the engineer who made it possible." Daniel accepted the glass with hands that were trembling slightly. The water was crystal clear, tasteless, except for the faint mineral content that indicated proper filtration without over-processing. According to Elena's testing equipment, it met WHO standards for purity and safety, better than the tap water in most American cities. But the real test wasn't the laboratory analysis. It was the expression on Santos's face as he drank his first cup of clean water from a system his community could operate and maintain independently. "It works," Santos said simply. It works, Daniel agreed. Over the following weeks, Daniel and Elena monitored the system's performance while training the village operators and troubleshooting minor issues that arose during the initial deployment. The technical challenges were manageable. A clogged filter here, a loose electrical connection there, the kind of problems they'd anticipated and designed solutions for. The human challenges were more complex, but ultimately more rewarding. Daniel watched Carlos develop an intuitive understanding of the system's rhythms, learning to recognize subtle changes in sound or vibration that indicated needed maintenance. Roberto became expert at optimizing the solar panel orientation for maximum efficiency, developing techniques that hadn't occurred to Daniel during the design phase. Miguel took charge of water quality testing, creating logs and procedures that would help the community track the system's performance over time. But it was the changes in the children that affected Daniel most profoundly. Within 2 weeks of the system coming online, the village clinic reported a dramatic decrease in waterborne illnesses. Kids who'd been chronically sick from contaminated well water were suddenly healthy and energetic. Families that had spent hours every day boiling water for drinking could redirect that time and fuel to other priorities. "You see the difference?" Santos asked one evening as they watched children playing soccer in the village square, children who a month earlier had been too sick to play. "I see it," Daniel said, thinking about Lily's question from that first morning. This was why losing his engineering career had made him sad, not because of pride or status, but because this work literally saved lives. Every calculation he'd struggled with, every design decision he'd agonized over, every 18-hour day he'd worked in Chicago had led to this moment: children laughing instead of coughing, families thriving instead of just surviving. The system ran flawlessly for 6 weeks. Then, on a humid Tuesday morning, it stopped working entirely. Daniel was reviewing performance data when Carlos came running to find him, his face tight with worry. "Senor Cross, something is wrong. The water has stopped flowing." Daniel's heart sank as he followed Carlos to the filtration system. The solar panels were receiving full sunlight. The control systems were powered up normally, but no water was coming from the output tap. According to the diagnostic display, the system had detected a critical fault and shut down to prevent damage. This was the moment Daniel had been dreading, the first major failure, the test of whether his bulletproof design was actually as resilient as he'd claimed. If he couldn't fix this problem quickly and teach the local operators how to prevent it in the future, the entire project would be viewed as another failed promise from the outside world. Daniel spent 2 hours diagnosing the problem, working through the system methodically, while a growing crowd of villagers watched with increasing anxiety. The pumps were functioning, the filters weren't clogged, the electrical connections were solid. Every component tested normal individually, but the system as a whole refused to produce water. "What do you think?" Elena asked quietly, as Daniel stared at the diagnostic readouts. "I think we're about to find out whether 6 months of design work was worth anything," Daniel replied, pulling out his toolkit. The problem turned out to be elegant in its simplicity. A pressure sensor had failed, causing the control system to think there was a dangerous overpressure condition, when in fact everything was functioning normally. It was exactly the kind of component failure Daniel had tried to design around. But apparently, his redundancy systems weren't as comprehensive as he'd hoped. "Can you fix it?" Santos asked, speaking for the entire community. "I can fix it," Daniel said. "But that's not the important question. The important question is whether Carlos and Roberto and Miguel can fix it when it happens again." Daniel spent the rest of the day not just repairing the sensor, but redesigning the diagnostic system to make this type of failure more obvious to local operators. He created a step-by-step troubleshooting guide, tested it with the village technicians, and modified the control software to provide clearer error messages when components failed. By evening, the system was running again, but more importantly, the village now had the knowledge and tools to handle similar problems independently. "You could have just fixed it and moved on," Carlos observed as they tested the repaired sensor. "Then what would you do when it breaks again after I'm gone?" Daniel asked. Carlos smiled. "Learn to fix it ourselves." Exactly. The failure and repair became a turning point in the village's relationship with the technology. Instead of viewing the filtration system as a mysterious gift from outsiders, they began to understand it as a tool they could master and control. Daniel watched Roberto develop his own diagnostic procedures, saw Miguel create maintenance schedules that anticipated problems before they occurred, observed Carlos training other community members in basic repair techniques. This was what Daniel had dreamed of during those long nights in Chicago. Not just installing equipment, but transferring knowledge, not just solving problems, but teaching communities to solve their own problems. 2 months after the installation, Daniel felt confident enough to begin planning his departure. The system was running smoothly, the local operators were fully trained, and the village had developed its own routines for maintenance and quality control. More importantly, they'd successfully handled 3 minor failures without outside assistance, proving that the technology transfer had been genuinely effective. "We will miss you," Santos said on their last evening in the village, "but we are grateful that you trusted us to take care of the system ourselves." "You don't need me anymore," Daniel said. That was always the goal. But as he packed his equipment and prepared for the journey back to Guatemala City, Daniel realized that the village had given him something far more valuable than he'd given them. They'd returned his faith in engineering as a tool for human improvement, reminded him that technical problems were ultimately human problems, and showed him that the work he did mattered in ways that could be measured in children's laughter and families' health. The flight back to Chicago was subdued, with Lily sleeping against his shoulder and Elena reviewing performance data from the field deployment. Daniel stared out the airplane window at the lights of cities passing below millions of people who turned taps and expected clean water to appear, most of them never thinking about the engineering marvels that made their comfortable lives possible. "It worked," Elena said quietly, not wanting to wake Lily. "It worked," Daniel agreed. "Morrison's going to be impressed. The performance data exceeded all our projections." Daniel nodded, but his mind was already racing ahead to the next challenges. Kenya in 3 weeks, where Dr. Patel would test the system's performance in different climatic conditions. The Philippines after that, where they'd evaluate effectiveness in communities with different technical capabilities. Each deployment would teach them something new, reveal weaknesses in the design that could be improved, demonstrate strengths that could be replicated. "Daniel," Elena said, "can I ask you something personal?" "Sure." "When you were working as a janitor, did you ever think this day would come that you'd be designing systems that could help millions of people?" Daniel thought about that question during the rest of the flight, watching Chicago's skyline grow larger through the airplane window. 3 months ago, he'd been emptying trash cans and wondering how to pay for Lily's school trip. Now he was returning from a successful field deployment of a system he'd designed, carrying data that would inform the next phase of a project that could ultimately serve 50 million people. But more importantly, he was returning as a father who could finally smile with his eyes, a man who'd remembered what it meant to do work that mattered, to solve problems that actually helped people, to be the engineer he'd always been meant to be. The airplane touched down at O'Hare just as the sun was rising over Lake Michigan, painting the city in shades of gold and possibility. Through the window, Daniel could see the Grant Industries Tower, rising above the Chicago skyline, 47 floors of steel and glass, and the accumulated dreams of people who believed engineering could change the world. In 6 months, Daniel had gone from cleaning those floors to helping design the future that would be built on them. The invisible janitor had become very visible indeed, and the world was starting to take notice. Isabella Grant was waiting for them at the gate, flanked by a small crowd of reporters and company executives who'd come to hear about the Guatemala deployment. Daniel felt a moment of panic. He'd spent 3 years perfecting the art of invisibility, and suddenly he was at the center of attention he'd never wanted. But then Lily squeezed his hand and said, "Daddy, you're smiling with your eyes again." And Daniel realized that visibility wasn't something to be feared when you had work worth being seen for. The questions from the reporters were predictable but enthusiastic. How did the system perform? What were the biggest challenges? When would the technology be available for larger-scale deployment? Daniel answered as best he could, trying to balance technical accuracy with human story, explaining not just what they'd built, but why it mattered. "Mr. Cross," one reporter called out, "6 months ago you were working as a janitor. Now you're leading one of the most important infrastructure projects in Grant Industries' history. How do you explain that transformation?" Daniel looked at Isabella, who nodded encouragingly, then at Lily, who was watching him with the kind of pride he'd dreamed of seeing in her eyes. "I didn't transform," Daniel said finally. "I remembered who I'd always been. Sometimes life forces you to become invisible, but that doesn't mean you disappear. The engineer was always there, he was just cleaning toilets while he waited for the right opportunity." The crowd laughed, but Daniel could see that some of them understood the deeper truth. In a world that often equated worth with job titles and salary figures, his story was a reminder that talent and passion and the ability to solve important problems could be found in the most unexpected places. After the reporters left and the executives returned to their offices, Isabella walked with Daniel and Lily toward the baggage claim, the 3 of them moving through the airport crowds like a small family, returning from vacation. "How does it feel?" Isabella asked. "Different," Daniel said. "Good, different. Ready for Kenya." Daniel looked down at Lily, who was still clutching her notebook full of sketches and observations from their time in Guatemala. 3 months ago, the thought of traveling to Africa would have seemed impossible financially, logistically, practically. Now it felt like the natural next step in a journey that was just beginning. "Ready," Daniel said. The baggage carousel was crowded with travelers retrieving suitcases and golf clubs and the accumulated souvenirs of vacations and business trips. Daniel waited for their bags, simple luggage containing clothes and equipment, and the documentation of work that might ultimately change millions of lives. But the real transformation wasn't in the suitcases or the technical reports or the performance data Elena was so excited about. The real transformation was in the way Lily looked at him now, not as the sad man who cleaned buildings at night, but as the engineer who built systems that helped children in distant villages drink clean water. As they walked toward the parking garage, Daniel caught his reflection in the airport windows. For the first time in 3 years, he recognized the man looking back at him. The invisible janitor was gone forever. In his place stood an engineer who remembered what it meant to smile with his eyes, who had work that mattered, and who was just getting started on the journey that would define the rest of his life. 6 months later, Daniel stood on a makeshift platform in the center of Kibera, one of Nairobi's largest slums, watching children fill plastic jugs with crystal-clear water from the latest installation of his filtration system. The Kenyan deployment had exceeded even their most optimistic projections, not just in technical performance, but in community adoption and sustainable operation. Dr. Patel's modifications for the East African climate had worked flawlessly, and the local operators had developed innovations that Daniel was already incorporating into future designs. Beside him, Lily sketched furiously in her notebook, now filled with observations from 3 continents and a dozen communities. At 7 years old, she'd become something of an expert on water purification systems, able to explain the basic principles to curious visitors and spot potential maintenance issues that sometimes escaped the adults. "Daddy," she said without looking up from her drawing. "Mrs. Johnson says I know more about engineering than most high school students." Mrs. Johnson was Lily's new teacher, a British expatriate who'd volunteered to provide remote schooling during their extended field deployments. Isabella had insisted on hiring her after realizing that Lily's unconventional education was producing results that exceeded traditional classroom learning. "Mrs. Johnson is probably right," Daniel said, watching his daughter capture not just the technical details of the water system, but the joy on the faces of the children using it. "But don't let it go to your head." The crowd around them was larger than usual, not just community members but government officials, NGO representatives, and journalists who'd come to document what the international press had started calling the cross method. Daniel's approach to water purification had attracted attention not just for its technical elegance, but for its emphasis on community ownership and sustainable operation. Minister Patricia Wanjiku, Kenya's Secretary for Water and Sanitation, stepped up to the microphone that had been set up for the ceremonial activation. She was a formidable woman in her 50s who'd spent decades fighting for infrastructure improvements in underserved communities. 6 months ago, Minister Wanjiku said, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd, Mr. Cross and his team promised us a water purification system that would work not just in laboratories, but in real communities with real challenges. Today we celebrate the fact that they kept that promise. The crowd applauded, and Daniel felt the familiar mix of pride and humility that accompanied these public moments. The success in Kibera wasn't just about engineering, it was about the dozens of local technicians who'd learned to operate and maintain the systems, the community leaders who'd organized training programs, the families who'd embraced new approaches to water safety and hygiene. But more importantly, Minister Wanjiku continued, this project has shown us that the best solutions come not from experts telling communities what they need, but from engineers who listen to what communities know they need. After the ceremony, Daniel found himself surrounded by the usual crowd of officials and reporters, all asking variations of the same questions. How scalable was the technology? When would it be available for wider deployment? What were his plans for expanding to other regions? The questions were important, but Daniel's attention kept drifting to a conversation happening at the edge of the crowd. Elena was speaking with Dr. Sarah Kimani, a Kenyan engineer, who'd been instrumental in the local deployment, and their discussion was clearly more than ceremonial small talk. "Excuse me," Daniel said to the reporter, who'd been asking about manufacturing costs. "I need to check on something." He made his way over to Elena and Dr. Kimani, arriving just as Elena was saying, "The filtration chemistry you've developed is brilliant. We should definitely incorporate it into the next generation design." Dr. Kimani smiled. "It's not brilliant, it's just adapted to local conditions. We have different mineral content in our groundwater, different bacterial challenges. The base system needed modifications to work optimally here." "That's exactly the point," Daniel said, joining the conversation. "Every deployment teaches us something we couldn't learn in a laboratory. Sarah, what you've done here isn't just a local improvement, it's going to make the system better everywhere." This had become Daniel's new understanding of engineering excellence, not the pursuit of perfect solutions designed in isolation, but the development of adaptive systems that improved through real-world implementation. Each community that adopted the water purification technology also contributed to its evolution, creating a feedback loop between human need and technical capability. Dr. Kimani nodded thoughtfully. "Mr. Cross, can I ask you something?" When you were designing the original system, did you anticipate this level of local innovation? Daniel considered the question carefully. I hoped for it, he said finally. The whole point of making the system modular and maintainable was to enable communities to adapt it to their specific needs. But honestly, I've been amazed by the improvements you and others have developed. That's because you designed it to be improved, Dr. Kamani said. Most systems are designed to be perfect from day one, which means they can't evolve. Yours was designed to learn. The observations stayed with Daniel as they prepared for their next deployment, the Philippines, where they'd be testing the system's performance in coastal communities, dealing with saltwater intrusion and typhoon-related infrastructure challenges. Each location presented unique engineering problems, but more importantly, each community offered unique insights into how technology could be adapted to serve human needs more effectively. 2 weeks later, Daniel and Lily were on another airplane, this time bound for Manila. The routine had become familiar, the long flights, the careful packing of equipment and documentation, the mixture of excitement and anxiety that accompanied each new deployment. But this trip felt different, charged with a significance that went beyond technical validation. Daddy, Lily said as they flew over the Pacific. Elena told me something interesting about the Philippines project. What's that? She said this might be the last testing deployment, that if it works here, the system will be ready for mass production. Daniel nodded. They'd been building toward this moment for almost a year, the transition from prototype testing to full-scale implementation. If the Philippine deployment succeeded, Grant Industries would begin manufacturing thousands of units for distribution across the developing world. How does that make you feel? Lily asked. It was a surprisingly sophisticated question from a 7-year-old, but Lily had been asking sophisticated questions since she could speak. Traveling the world and observing engineering projects had only sharpened her ability to see the big picture. Excited, Daniel said, and terrified. Why terrified? Daniel thought about how to explain the weight of responsibility he felt. Because if we've made mistakes in the design, those mistakes will be replicated thousands of times. If we haven't anticipated certain problems, those problems will affect hundreds of communities. But if you've done it right, if we've done it right, millions of people will have access to clean water who didn't before. Lily nodded gravely, as if she understood the magnitude of what hung in the balance. Then she brightened. But you have done it right, haven't you? I mean, it worked in Guatemala and Kenya. It worked in Guatemala and Kenya, Daniel agreed. But the Philippines will test different aspects of the system. Saltwater corrosion, typhoon resilience, humid climate effects on the electronics. The truth was that Daniel felt more confident about this deployment than any previous one. The system had been refined through 2 successful field tests, incorporating improvements and adaptations that addressed real-world challenges they couldn't have anticipated during laboratory development. More importantly, they'd developed training protocols and community engagement strategies that had proven effective across different cultures and technical capabilities. But confidence and certainty were different things, and Daniel had learned to be wary of certainty in engineering. The best solutions were often discovered through failure and adaptation, not through perfect initial design. The Philippine deployment took place in Barangay Sagrada, a coastal community of about 300 people on the island of Luzon. The village had been devastated by Typhoon Paolo 2 years earlier, and while the physical infrastructure had been rebuilt, the community was still struggling with contaminated groundwater and unreliable access to clean drinking water. Captain Rosa Delgado, the village leader, greeted them with the kind of pragmatic skepticism Daniel had learned to appreciate in community officials. She'd seen promises before, watched well-meaning projects fail due to poor planning or inadequate follow-through. Mr. Cross, Captain Delgado said, as they surveyed the installation site. "I must be honest with you. We have had engineers here before. They build systems, they leave, and within 6 months, the systems break and cannot be repaired." "I understand," Daniel replied. "That's why we're not leaving until we're confident your people can maintain this system independently. And if it fails after you leave, then we come back," Daniel said, "as many times as necessary." Captain Delgado nodded slowly. "You said the same thing in Kenya, according to Minister Wanjiku. She spoke very highly of your work there." The installation in the Philippines presented unique challenges that tested every aspect of the system's design. The high humidity wreaked havoc on electronic components, requiring modifications to the control systems and protective enclosures. Salt spray from the nearby ocean accelerated corrosion of metal components, leading to design changes that would improve durability in all coastal installations. The community's experience with typhoons meant they needed systems that could be quickly disassembled and protected when severe weather threatened. But the most significant challenge was cultural rather than technical. The Philippines had a rich tradition of Bayanihan community cooperation in solving problems that required Daniel to approach technology transfer differently than he had in Guatemala or Kenya. Instead of training individual operators, he needed to develop systems that the entire community could understand and maintain collectively. Elena worked with local women's groups to establish water quality monitoring protocols, while Daniel collaborated with the village's skilled craftsmen to adapt maintenance procedures to local tools and materials. Lily, meanwhile, had appointed herself as the community's unofficial engineering translator, helping bridge communication gaps between the technical team and local residents who spoke limited English. "Uncle Daniel," said Rico Mendoza, one of the village's master fishermen, who'd volunteered to learn the system's operation, "this machine is very different from what we expected." They were standing beside the filtration unit during its first week of operation, watching the steady stream of purified water that had quickly become the center of community life. Children lined up with containers every morning. Families had established new routines around water collection and storage, and the village health clinic was already reporting fewer cases of waterborne illness. "Different how?" Daniel asked. "We thought it would be complicated like the machines the government brought after the typhoon. Those machines needed specialists to operate special tools to repair. This machine, it wants to work with us, not against us." The observation captured something essential about Daniel's design philosophy that he'd never been able to articulate clearly. The best engineering solutions didn't fight against human nature or local conditions. They worked with both creating harmony between technical capability and human need. 3 months into the Philippine deployment, Daniel received a call that changed everything. Isabella Grant was flying to Manila, bringing with her a delegation from the United Nations and representatives from several major international development organizations. The water purification project had attracted global attention, and there was serious discussion about implementing the technology on a massive scale. "How massive?" Daniel asked during their secure video conference. "Initial projections suggest we could serve 20 million people within 5 years, Isabella said. "But that's just the beginning. If the Philippine deployment validates our scalability models, we're looking at potentially reaching our original target of 50 million people within a decade." Daniel felt a familiar mix of excitement and terror. The numbers were staggering: 50 million people gaining access to clean water because of systems he'd designed. Communities transformed because of technology he'd developed during those long nights in Chicago when he'd been trying to remember how to be an engineer. "There's something else," Isabella continued. "The UN delegation wants to meet with you directly. They're talking about establishing a new international initiative for water security with our technology as the foundation. You'd be the technical director." What would that mean? It would mean leaving Grant Industries, Isabella said. Not immediately, but within a year or two. You'd be heading up a new organization focused specifically on water security in underserved communities. Unlimited budget global mandate, direct support from member nations. Daniel stared at the video screen, trying to process the implications. A year ago, he'd been pushing mops and emptying trash cans. Now he was being offered the opportunity to lead a global initiative that could transform how the world approached one of its most pressing challenges. I need to think about it, he said finally. Of course. But Daniel, this is what you were meant to do. This is why you pulled me out of that burning car. Why you spent 3 years learning humility. Why you never gave up on the idea that engineering could change the world. After the call ended, Daniel sat in his temporary office in Barangay Sagrada, looking out at a community that had been transformed by the simple act of turning a valve and producing clean water. Children played in the plaza who'd been sick 6 months earlier. Families had time for education and economic development because they no longer spent hours every day dealing with water-related health problems. This was the visible impact of invisible work, the way that solving technical problems created space for human flourishing. Lily found him there an hour later, still staring out the window at the bustling community life that clean water had made possible. Elena told me about the UN thing, she said, settling into the chair beside his desk. What do you think? Daniel asked. I think Mommy would be proud, Lily said simply. The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. In all the excitement and success of the past year, he'd sometimes forgotten that Sarah wasn't there to share it with them. She'd never seen the systems they'd designed save lives, never watched Lily grow into a confident young woman who understood that engineering could be a form of love. She would be proud. Daniel agreed, his voice thick with emotion. But she'd also want to know if you're happy, Lily continued. Not just proud of the work, but happy doing it. Daniel looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw not just Sarah's features, but Sarah's wisdom, the ability to ask the questions that cut through complexity to essential truth. I am happy, he said. Happier than I've been since before Mommy got sick. Then that's your answer. 3 weeks later, the UN delegation arrived in Barangay Sagrada for what had been billed as a routine assessment visit, but felt more like a state inspection. Secretary General Maria Santos, no relation to Miguel Santos from Guatemala, led a team of water security experts, development economists, and policy specialists who spent 2 days examining every aspect of the Philippine deployment. Daniel had prepared extensive documentation, performance data, community feedback, technical specifications, scalability analyses, but the delegation seemed more interested in watching the system operate in real-world conditions, observing how community members interacted with the technology, understanding the social and economic impacts of reliable access to clean water. Mr. Cross, Secretary General Santos said, as they watched Rico Mendoza train a new group of operators, your system is impressive from a technical standpoint. But what strikes me most is how naturally it fits into community life. Most development projects feel imposed from the outside. This feels organic. That's because it was designed by communities as much as by engineers, Daniel replied. Every deployment has taught us something new about how the technology needs to adapt to local conditions and cultural practices. And you believe this approach can scale to serve tens of millions of people? Daniel thought about the question carefully. A year ago, he would have answered with technical specifications and manufacturing projections. Now he understood that scalability wasn't just about production capacity. It was about maintaining the human connection that made the technology work in the first place. I believe it can scale if we resist the temptation to standardize away the local adaptations that make it effective, he said. The moment we start building one-size-fits-all systems, we lose the community ownership that makes sustainable operation possible. Secretary General Santos nodded thoughtfully. That's a more sophisticated answer than we usually hear from engineers. I spent 3 years learning that sophistication isn't the same thing as complexity, Daniel said. Sometimes the most sophisticated solution is also the simplest one. The UN assessment concluded with a formal presentation in the community center where Captain Delgado and other village leaders shared their experiences with the water purification system. The presentations were conducted in Tagalog with English translation, but the passion and gratitude came through in any language. This machine has given us more than clean water, Captain Delgado said. It has given us time our children can spend in school instead of walking to distant wells, time our families can spend together instead of caring for sick relatives, time our community can spend building a better future instead of just surviving. After the presentations, Secretary General Santos pulled Daniel aside for a private conversation. They walked to the edge of the village where the water purification system hummed quietly in its protective enclosure, solar panels gleaming in the tropical sun. "Mr. Cross," she said, "I want to offer you something unprecedented. The United Nations is prepared to create a new agency, the Global Water Security Initiative, with you as its founding director. Unlimited budget, direct access to member nation resources, authority to implement solutions anywhere they're needed." Daniel felt his heart rate accelerate. This was the opportunity he'd dreamed of during those long nights designing filtration systems in his Chicago office, the chance to take his work global, to implement solutions that could transform millions of lives. "What would be my mandate?" he asked. "Simple," Secretary General Santos said. "Bring clean water to everyone who needs it, using whatever methods prove most effective. And my conditions, you can have any conditions you want." Daniel thought about the past year, the deployments in Guatemala and Kenya and the Philippines, the communities that had embraced not just his technology, but his approach to engineering as a collaborative art form. The success hadn't come from imposing solutions from above, but from listening to local needs and adapting technology to serve human requirements. "I want to maintain the community-centered approach," he said. "No top-down mandates, no standardized systems that ignore local conditions. Every deployment has to be a collaboration between engineers and communities." "Agreed. I want to hire locally whenever possible. Train community members not just to operate systems, but to modify and improve them." "Agreed. And I want my daughter to be able to travel with me. Her education has been unconventional, but it's working." Secretary General Santos smiled. "Mr. Cross, your daughter has become something of a legend in international development circles. There are universities that would offer her scholarships based on her field notebooks alone." Daniel laughed, thinking about Lily's sketches and observations, her ability to spot engineering problems and cultural opportunities that escaped the adults around her. "She's planning to study engineering when she's older, says she wants to design systems that help people like her mom and dad did. The world will need engineers like her." That evening, Daniel sat with Lily on the beach near Barangay Sagrada, watching the sun set over the South China Sea. The village behind them was alive with the sounds of community life, children playing, families preparing dinner, the gentle hum of the water purification system that had become the heart of their transformed daily routine. "So you're going to take the job?" Lily asked. "I think so," Daniel said. "What do you think?" "I think it's what Mommy would want you to do," Lily said. "And I think it's what you want to do too. Even if it means more traveling, more time away from a normal life." Lily gestured toward the village where families were gathering around the water station for their evening collection ritual. "Daddy, this is our normal life now, and I wouldn't trade it for anything." Daniel pulled his daughter closer, feeling the warm breeze off the ocean, and listening to the sounds of a community that had been transformed by something as simple as access to clean water. A year ago, he'd been invisible, a janitor cleaning buildings, while the world's important work happened around him. Now he was on the verge of leading a global initiative that could change millions of lives. But the real transformation wasn't in his job title or his responsibilities, or the recognition he'd received from international organizations. The real transformation was in remembering who he'd always been, an engineer, who believed that technical problems were ultimately human problems, a father who wanted to show his daughter that work could be a form of love, a man who'd learned to smile with his eyes again. 6 months later, Daniel stood at the podium in the United Nations General Assembly Hall in New York, delivering his first report as director of the Global Water Security Initiative. Behind him, a massive screen showed photographs from water purification installations around the world: Guatemala, Kenya, the Philippines, and dozens of other communities that had embraced the technology and made it their own. In the past 18 months, Daniel said, his voice carrying to delegates from 193 member nations, we have installed water purification systems serving over 500,000 people. But more importantly, we have proven that the most sophisticated engineering solutions are often the simplest ones, technologies that work with communities instead of being imposed upon them. In the audience, Isabella Grant sat with the Grant Industries delegation, smiling as she watched the man she'd pulled from invisibility address the leaders of the world. Beside her, Elena Vasquez and Dr. Patel compared notes on the latest technical innovations emerging from field deployments. At the back of the hall, Lily Cross sat with Mrs. Johnson, sketching the proceedings in her notebook and quietly correcting the technical accuracy of the simultaneous translations. Our goal, Daniel continued, remains unchanged from the day we began this work. 50 million people with access to clean water within the next decade. But we've learned that numbers alone don't capture the true impact of this initiative. Every family that no longer loses children to waterborne disease, every community that can redirect time and energy from survival to development, every village that takes ownership of its own technological solutions, these are the real measures of our success. The applause that followed was polite but enthusiastic, the kind of response that suggested genuine appreciation rather than diplomatic obligation. As Daniel left the podium, he was surrounded by the usual crowd of reporters and officials and representatives from organizations wanting to partner with the Global Water Security Initiative. But his attention was drawn to a familiar face in the crowd, Miguel Santos from Guatemala, now serving as a regional coordinator for the initiative, had flown to New York specifically to attend Daniel's presentation. Senor Cross, Santos said, embracing him warmly. You remember what I told you in our village? That you hoped the system would work, Daniel replied. No, Santos corrected with a smile. I said I hoped you would remember who you were meant to be. Daniel looked around the General Assembly Hall at the delegates and officials and reporters, at the photographs of communities transformed by access to clean water, at his daughter proudly showing her sketches to anyone who would look. I remember, he said. That evening, Daniel and Lily walked through Central Park, enjoying a rare break from the constant travel and meetings that had become their new normal. The autumn air was crisp with the promise of winter, and the park was filled with families enjoying the weekend together. Daddy, Lily said as they paused beside the reservoir, do you ever miss being invisible? The question surprised Daniel with its perceptiveness. At 9 years old, Lily had developed an understanding of human nature that rivaled most adults, probably because she'd spent the past 2 years observing communities around the world and learning how people adapted to change. Sometimes, Daniel said honestly, invisibility was safe. No one expected anything from you. No one criticized your mistakes. No one depended on your decisions. But invisible people can't change the world, Daniel said. And I've learned that changing the world is what I was always meant to do. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, watching joggers and dog walkers and tourists enjoying the peaceful Sunday afternoon. Daniel thought about the journey that had brought them here, from that morning 3 years ago when he'd pulled Isabella Grant from her burning car, to this moment when he was leading a global initiative that had already transformed hundreds of communities. But the real measure of success wasn't in the statistics or the recognition or the opportunities that kept expanding beyond his wildest dreams. The real measure of success was in the way Lily looked at him now, not as the sad man who'd lost his way after her mother died, but as the father who'd found his purpose in serving others. "Daddy," Lily said, as they reached the edge of the park, "I've been thinking about what I want to study in college." "Oh, still thinking about engineering?" "Yes, but specifically water and sanitation engineering. I want to work on systems that help people like you and Mommy did." Daniel stopped walking and knelt down to look at his daughter at eye level. In her face, he saw not just Sarah's features, but Sarah's passion for using technical knowledge to solve human problems, Sarah's belief that engineering could be a form of love made manifest in the world. "Your mother would be so proud," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Are you proud?" Lily asked. Daniel thought about the question seriously, looking at the young woman. His daughter was becoming confident, curious, compassionate, committed to using her talents in service of others. She'd grown up watching communities transform through access to clean water, learning that work could be meaningful, understanding that the best solutions came from collaboration rather than competition. "I'm not just proud," Daniel said. "I'm amazed. You've become everything your mother and I hoped you would be." As they walked home through the streets of Manhattan, Daniel reflected on the strange trajectory that had brought them to this point. 3 years ago, he'd been a broken man pushing mops through empty office buildings, wondering if he'd ever do meaningful work again. Now, he was leading an international initiative that had already improved hundreds of thousands of lives and was positioned to help millions more. But the transformation hadn't happened because someone had recognized his hidden potential or offered him a lucky break. It had happened because Isabella Grant had seen something in him that he'd forgotten existed, not just technical competence, but the passion and humility and collaborative spirit that made engineering a tool for human improvement rather than just professional advancement. The invisible janitor had become visible not through self-promotion or networking or strategic career moves, but through the simple act of doing work that mattered and doing it with integrity and care and the deep understanding that all technical problems were ultimately human problems. As they entered their hotel, Daniel's phone buzzed with a text message from Elena, who was currently in Morocco overseeing another deployment. "System in Marrakesh running perfectly. Community has already made 3 improvements we never thought of. When are you coming to visit?" Daniel smiled, thinking about the dozens of communities around the world where his water purification systems were humming quietly in the background of daily life, providing the clean water that made everything else possible. Each installation was unique, adapted to local conditions and cultural practices, maintained by people who understood that technology worked best when it served human needs rather than imposing external requirements. "Where are we going next?" Lily asked, noticing his expression. "Morocco," Daniel said. "Want to see how water purification works in the desert?" "Always," Lily replied with the enthusiasm of someone who'd learned that the world was full of problems worth solving and communities worth serving. As they rode the elevator up to their room, Daniel caught his reflection in the polished metal doors. The face looking back at him was tired, but happy, marked by sun and wind, from a dozen different climates, but animated by the kind of purpose that made exhaustion irrelevant. He was smiling with his eyes, not the forced expression he'd worn during those years of invisible desperation, but the genuine joy of a man who'd remembered what he was meant to do with his life and had found a way to do it. The journey from invisible janitor to global water security director had taken less than 3 years, but Daniel understood that the real transformation had happened in a single moment on a frozen Chicago morning when he'd made the choice to help someone in need without expecting anything in return. Sometimes the most important decisions were the ones you made without thinking, guided by instinct and decency rather than calculation and ambition. Sometimes heroism looked like nothing more than doing what needed to be done because it needed to be done. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, those instinctive acts of service created opportunities to serve on a scale you'd never imagined possible. Daniel Cross had learned to smile with his eyes again, and 50 million people would have clean water because of it. But more importantly, his daughter had learned that work could be a form of love, that technical knowledge could serve human need, and that the best engineering solutions were the ones that helped communities flourish. The invisible man had become visible, and the world was beginning to change in ways that would echo for generations. Through their hotel window, Manhattan sparkled in the darkness. 8 million people who turned taps and expected clean water to appear. Most of them never thinking about the engineering marvels that made their comfortable lives possible. But somewhere in Morocco, in Guatemala, in Kenya, in the Philippines, and in dozens of other communities around the world, families were gathering around water stations that carried Daniel Cross's signature, simple, robust, community-owned systems that would keep working long after their designer had moved on to the next challenge. The janitor's story had become a legend, but more importantly, his work had become a legacy that would outlive any individual recognition or professional achievement. And in the morning, he and Lily would board another airplane bound for another community that needed clean water and the kind of engineering solutions that worked with people rather than being imposed upon them. The invisible man's journey was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning.